Women in medieval times would wake up before sunrise and get the fire going. They would also make breakfast to feed the children. Later on, they checked the animals, but then would come back and make dinner just to do it again tomorrow. That was an average Tuesday in medieval England for a peasant woman. Actually, pretty much every other day was like this, if it wasn't a church holiday. Before we get into the details though, there's one thing worth clearing up first. The word medieval has picked up a meaning over the centuries that wasn't really earned. It's become shorthand for backward, can also be used for brutal or ignorant, especially when it comes to how women lived. It was actually invented later by Renaissance thinkers who wanted to contrast their own era with what came before then. A typical day for a medieval peasant woman was dictated almost entirely by the calendar. Not a work calendar, but rather the agricultural and religious calendar, which in medieval England were basically the same thing. The church organized the year into a rhythm of feast days, fast days, and harvest seasons that every person in the village lived inside of without much question. That calendar told you when to work and when to go without. During planting season, she would be out in the fields alongside her husband and every other person working under the manor lord. During harvest, she would be there too. And this was all hands, no exceptions, because a harvest not brought in on time would leave them starving. The rest of the year she was managing a household that had no running water and no day off unless the church said so. Medieval people had more holidays than most modern workers. The problem was that many of them were religious fasts rather than feasts, which helped with the spiritual situation but not the caloric one. Through the growing months, alongside everything else, she tended a kitchen garden, fruits, vegetables, herbs. With the herbs, headaches were common, stomach troubles were a reliable feature of life, and whatever grew in that garden was the medicine cabinet. There were no pharmacies during this time, so there were women who knew plants. That knowledge passed mother to daughter for generations and carried real weight in the community. The house itself was small and cheap, using a wood frame with plaster walls, a thatched roof repaired with straw as needed, and, when maintained properly, genuinely watertight. A few shuttered windows to keep out wind and rain. Along one wall, the family beds were there, and not individual beds necessarily. Children often shared places to sleep while using a trunk or cupboard to hold the family's clothes. In the center or along another wall was a fire. The fire was everything from warmth to cooking and even heating water. The entire domestic life of the household organized itself around that fire. The kitchen setup was minimal but functional because a ceramic pot could go directly into the flames, long-handled spoons and forks for cooking, and a spit for roasting meat over the fire. If the family was doing reasonably well while using a copper or bronze pot, that would mean losing it would have been a real setback. Breakfast was porridge, and pretty much always porridge, served in wooden bowls with a cup of very lightly fermented grain drink that is safer than drinking untreated water. In season, some fresh fruit rounded it out. When out of season, it was preserves or pickled vegetables that had been put up earlier in the year. The evening meal was usually a stew or soup from the same ceramic pot, heavy on whatever vegetables were available and light on meat, with bread always on the table. Fresh bread with butter when possible, and when the bread had gone stale, it became something called a trencher, used as an edible plate to hold the rest of the food. Nothing was wasted, since wasting in that economy wasn't a moral failing, it was just unaffordable. The bread didn't even come from her kitchen. It was baked in a community oven, made from flour ground at the community grain mill, and a portion of both went to the manor lord as payment for access. She paid to use them in labor and produce, and that arrangement was so standard it barely registered as unusual. It was just your average Tuesday. Before eating, the family washed their hands, either in a basin or bucket, possibly with homemade soap. Matter of fact, this is a good moment to address the hygiene myth, because it needs addressing. The story that medieval people were dirty and basically lived in filth is one of those historical myths that absolutely refuses to die, no matter how many times historians correct it. Here is what was actually true. A full bath happened a few times a year at most. That's the common misconception. However, hands and faces were washed daily. A wet cloth was used to clean the rest of the body as needed. Anyone who lived near a pond or stream, which in rural England was most people, would take a dip after a long day in the fields. Laundry happened regularly, particularly undergarments. A fresh undergarment went a long way toward feeling clean, even if the outer clothing was just spot cleaned. Soap itself was made at home during the winter months, one of the many productive tasks that filled the colder season when fieldwork wasn't possible. For families with livestock, which most peasant families had alongside their barn, that wasn't a separate building across a yard. It was attached to the house, separated from the living space by a partial wall that didn't reach the ceiling. The animals' body heat helped warm the house through the English winter. Their proximity made them significantly harder to steal. Therefore, it meant that checking on a sick animal at 3 a.m. in January didn't require going outside. Did it smell? Yes, absolutely. Was it also a completely rational arrangement given the circumstances? Also, yes. Almost every peasant family kept chickens. Eggs were valuable beyond their nutritional contribution, since they could supplement income and could be used to pay some of the dues owed to the landlord. The landlord even accepted actual eggs. That's how integrated animals were into the entire economic system of medieval village life. A cat was considered a genuine asset for what it kept out of the food stores. A dog was there for protection and livestock herding. These weren't like pets in the modern sense. They were working members of the household with specific economic roles, and their value was understood by everyone in the family, including the children. The work a peasant woman did is probably the most surprising part of this for modern viewers, who've absorbed a picture of medieval gender roles as rigidly divided. They weren't at the peasant level, though. Peasant women planted and harvested alongside men, and we can't forget they cared for livestock. The strict gender division of labor was more of an upper-class phenomenon, where noble and wealthy households had much more clearly defined roles because they could afford the specialization. And then on top of the fieldwork was the household work. Cooking every day from scratch was not a casual hobby but a serious production task, mainly because cloth had to come from somewhere, and buying it cost money the family might not have. The best method was preserving food for winter through drying, salting, smoking, and pickling. And in the winter months when fieldwork wasn't possible, taking on piecework or small paid tasks in order to bring in a little extra income or fulfill obligations to the manor. What made all of this survivable was community. The multi-generational structure of medieval village life meant that childcare could be handled by whoever was available when a woman's labor was needed elsewhere, whether a mother, older daughter, or even a spinster sister. That spinster, in medieval terms, meant specifically a woman who spins thread for a living, since spinning was work associated with unmarried women past the typical age of marriage. The word only became a negative term later. In medieval England, a spinster was just someone with a specific trade. Instead, women who weren't related could also trade childcare for each other, working out informal arrangements based on need and reciprocal obligation. The village was the support system, but without it, nothing worked. Children in this system grew up fast and working. Formal schooling existed, but was largely beside the point for peasant families. Reading wasn't required for the life they were going to live. What was required was knowing how to do the work, so children learned by doing it alongside their parents from the time they were old enough to be useful. Boys generally moved into their father's trade. Girls learned household management and childcare from an extremely young age, meaning ages that would be considered shockingly premature today. Basic numeracy was taught informally because you needed to be able to count what you were owed and what you owed. Both boys and girls could be sent into domestic service, typically at the direction of the manor lord, or apprenticed into a trade. These weren't purely parental decisions. The lord's involvement in the lives of the people working his land was constant and reached into details of family life that feel deeply intrusive by modern standards. Marriage among peasants was one of the few areas where they genuinely had something the upper classes didn't, and that was choice. At the nobility level, marriage was a contract between families arranging the transfer of property and establishing the legitimacy of heirs. It was carefully calculated and rarely about the feelings of the people getting married. Conversely, peasant families had little property to transfer, which meant peasant couples could and often did choose each other based on something closer to preference. That doesn't mean love matches were universal or that family opinion didn't matter, yet the space for personal choice was real. And here's something that genuinely surprises people. Many peasant couples weren't formally married at all. Informal unions were two people living together and functioning as a family, recognized by the community as such, were common and carried legitimacy. The community's recognition was what mattered in practical terms. A formal church ceremony was ideal and did happen, but the absence of one didn't necessarily make children illegitimate in the community's eyes. The church preferred otherwise, but the church and the reality on the ground weren't always the same thing. Women who married could expect to be pregnant multiple times across their adult lives. 10 or more pregnancies was not unusual. Either way, not all children survived to adulthood, especially in a world without antibiotics. Without the interventions of modern medicine, a simple infection could kill a child. A woman took a genuine physical risk every time she gave birth. The mortality rates around childbirth were real and documented and accepted as part of life in a way that is difficult to sit with when looking at the numbers clearly. Babies who survived were kept at the breast until around age 2, which helped space out pregnancies somewhat. Inheritance was another area where the system worked against women in most situations. The eldest son inherited. A married woman's property went to her husband. She didn't lose it exactly, but she lost individual control of it. There was an exception worth noting though. A woman who remained unmarried could inherit property in her own name and manage it independently. It was a narrow window, and it wasn't designed to give women power because it was a practical fix for situations where there was no male heir. Women who eventually found themselves in that position sometimes wielded real economic authority. Within her household, a peasant woman made decisions every day about food, about children, and even about the domestic economy that kept the family alive. In her community, her knowledge carried weight, and so did the herbs in her garden. Starting from the preservation techniques she'd learned from her mother, the web of reciprocal arrangements that held village life together. She had no access to formal education or public life in the way we'd know now, but she wasn't nothing. A woman in medieval England wanted the same things most women today want: a roof over her head, with enough food to eat while having clothes on her children. Not only happiness for herself, but for her family, and more than anything, her kids to do better than she did.